Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our third of four webinar series with Hills. This one is going to be really exciting because we are going to be sharing a ton of data. Some of the data is in our report, some of it we haven't yet released. So we're going to cut right to the chase and get started, but wanted to thank everybody for coming. Of course, thank our sponsor, Hills, and I'm going to turn it over to Tori.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Letting a few more people in, of course. Some general housekeeping. First of all, if you are just joining us, please put your name, who you are in the chat, which organization you're with. We would love to hear from you and get everything rolling in the chat. We will be trying to our best to stick to an hour. If you have any questions all along the way, please feel free to put those in the Q&A. We have members of our data team that are ready to answer any questions if there are some about the data. If we don't get to them, we will do our best to get them in as part of the recap, answering those questions. Hello, everyone. And if you want, feel free, you can also have some dialogue in the chat. Feel free to put those questions. This is going to be recorded. We will be sharing this very shortly after it is out, and along with a recap, we'll send it out via email. It'll also be posted to our social media pages, and so you'll get that information after the fact if there's anything that you missed or if you want to send it to any of your team, whomever. So we are going to be going through several sections today. So our speakers, you just met Stephanie, our executive director. I'm the director of communications for Shelter Animals Count. And then you're going to hear from Megan Lehman, who is the senior manager, brand management or brand engagement for Shelters for Hills Pet Nutrition here in a bit. So the order that we're going to go, we're going to talk about the SAC data first, and then Megan's going to be joining us to talk about the state of the shelter report this year for Hills, which was very, very exciting to be able to see that. And then we're going to have a little bit of a section where we're going to do a back and forth just to show some of their data and how our data at SAC compares to that. And then at the end, Stephanie is going to be going over a brand new report that we have not even released yet, but we're going to be preliminary sharing our results from a survey that we conducted with our member organizations on adoption hours and policies survey. So at the very end, we're going to be discussing that. Has some really, really interesting insights and data that are a part of that. So that'll be at the very end. So stay tuned for that. And of course, if you are not a contributing member of Shelter Animals Count, we would love to have your data be a part of the story. So your data helps us be able to tell what is happening in animal welfare. Every number counts, every animal counts, and every organization matters, no matter how big or how small you are. You can also see trends and analysis from all of the organizations who contribute data, as well as how that feeds into our model for our data. And we have publicly available dashboards, and we're adding new ones all the time that you can go and see, but we have our national statistics dashboard, our state dashboard. And then we also have, if you are a contributing member to Shelter Animals Count, we also have our member exclusive dashboards that are in the portal. So don't forget that there's a wealth of data and information that you can get as a contributing member to SAC through that. So you can look at how your organization compares to others around you and across the nation. You can look at population balance data. There's all sorts of information within your portal. If you have any issues ever getting into that, please reach out to us at info@shelteranimalscount.org, and we'll be able to help you get in there if we have any questions too. We provide 2 reports a year that are our big reports. So we just released our mid-year report that we're going to be talking about today. And then, of course, we have our annual report that will come out in early 2026. New this year, we have launched several other types of reports. So we just released our altered status and intake data report. If you missed that, feel free to go and look at that on our website. We can put a link to it in the chat as well. And we just hosted another webinar with Dr. Julie Levy on the results of that report and what she is seeing from her surveys. And so there's a lot of great information that's in that. And we have other reports, including our adoption report that we're getting ready to release. Then we also have a comprehensive data basics workbook that we released with Hills Pet Nutrition last year. So this is a fabulous resource if you have staff that are new to animal welfare, board members, anybody who just needs to kind of understand the basics of why this data and why sheltering data is so important to the overall story. Talks a lot about data standardization, and we have an animal welfare glossary that we revised as part of this as well. So that is on our website, and Samantha just put a link to that in the chat. Thank you so much to that. And then wanted to mention, if you are a shelter rescue organization and you use any of these softwares, that we do have APIs available. So if you're tired of automatic data entry, you want to do automatic data transmissions, please go and get signed up for our APIs if you use any of these softwares. That way your data will automatically come over. You don't have to worry about manually entering that data anymore. And new, if you're a Chameleon user, we now offer a secure process for users to submit your monthly summary, intake, and outcome data that we just launched. And so if you are a Chameleon shelter and you would like to learn more about this, we can absolutely help you with that as well. And because of the organizations that we have submit data to us, we are the most trusted analysis of animal sheltering data. We have an advanced scientific model that we launched in 2024. There's more information about this on our website, how we collect and analyze the data for this reporting. We also now offer animal level data for richer insights. So you're going to see a lot of animal level data today throughout this presentation. And in our reports, we've added a lot of new data into this report about org type data. There's so much information. This is also used for policymakers, shelters, industry leaders to guide decisions and strategies. And then we use state lists to keep our organizations updated, along with working with dedicated volunteers to assist with any organization contact updates, as there are over 14 or close to 14,000 organizations that are providing animal sheltering in the country. All right. So diving into our mid-year analysis, my goal with this is to not just like read through the report. You can absolutely do that, but we're going to be going over a lot of the data from the report. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask those in the Q&A. We're going to be talking about comparing January through June of this year to January through June of 2024. There is so much new data in this report that has not been reported on in the past. We have a lot of org type data that we're going to go over, owner surrender versus strays. I mean, there's just a lot in here, and including some things that weren't even in the report itself. So excited to dive on in. All right, so first we looked at community intakes. So overall, community intakes. So these are intakes that are excluding transfers. So it's what is happening within the community itself. So when we look at, we're going to look at dogs and cats and then both of them together. So first we're looking at dogs. So we had 1.4 million dogs in our shelters in the first half of the year, which was down 5% compared to the first half of 2024. Dog intakes have shown steady month-over-month decreases so far this year, with every month tracking below last year. But you can see with our forecasting that we have for 2025 that we are looking at dogs potentially forecasting above 2024. We provide that forecasting of key data through the end of the year to assist organizations with understanding kind of where intakes and outcomes may end up if nothing were to change in the data as we're seeing it today. Forecasting does require multiple years of monthly data to accurately account for seasonality, which is very prevalent to cats that you're going to see in a moment. And we included data from January 2016 through January 2025, or through June 2025, with our forecasting model. So it's taking in all of the data that we have that leads into that forecasting model. So dogs, pretty steady. We look at cats, not so. Obviously we know where the kittens come in in our community intakes. Where the kitten starts to come in are in May. If you missed it, we had a great webinar with Hills where we dove into a lot of the kitten data, and we looked at cat intakes by age and really broke it down. And so when we looked at that, we saw that kittens that were under that 8-week mark, the neonate kittens, those are the ones that are coming in May. And then we started to see more juvenile kittens coming in June and July. So those 8 week to 5 month old kittens. And so cat intakes tell a similar story. 1.4 million cats, same amount of them as dogs, came in, and it was down 3% compared to in 2024. And forecasting for the year looks to be a little bit below 2024. And so when we put those two together, this is what the chart is looking like for the year. So of course, seasonality, we'll start to see some decline with cats that are coming in towards the end of the year. Community intakes by org type detail. So when we looked at how those community intakes break out by org type, government shelters are still taking in nearly half of community intakes. So and then we broke it down by org type for dogs and cats, looking at it from a national perspective. So government shelters take in 54% of all dog intakes, but 42% of cat intakes, highlighting the differences in intake volume with species. Shelters with municipal contracts accounted for roughly 22% of intakes for both species, while private shelters handled 10% of dog intakes and 17% of cat intakes. Rescues make up the remaining 14% of dogs and 18% for cats. So overall, remember 1.4 million dogs entered shelters. So we continue to see stray dogs make up the largest portion of dog intakes at 56%, which is down 1% compared to last year. Owner surrenders have risen up to 31%, and other sources steady at 13. This second chart shows that community intakes for dogs have decreased for all organization types. So this is proportion of org type intakes by dog size. So this I thought was really interesting to look at, especially for the large dogs. The large dogs, it feels like we have more large dogs than we do of any other dog size. And so this chart was really interesting for me to look at. And it shows that primarily due to decreases in stray intakes, but shelters with contract and private shelters have seen small increases in owner surrenders, 2% and 1%, respectively. But community intakes across the board have decreased for all organization types. When we look at cats, so 1.4 million cats entering shelters, again, down 3% compared to 2024. Intake patterns have remained consistent. Stray cats are at 59%. Owner surrenders are at 31, with other sources at 10. And then we also broke this down. The chart looks a little bit different, but it's proportion of org type intakes by cat ages. Government had the highest underage kitten counts coming in, with rescues having the most juveniles and adults. Shelters with contracts had the most seniors, which was interesting. And when we look at ages, just to break this out by kittens, so neonates are under 4 weeks. Then the weaned / transitional cats are 4 weeks to 8 weeks. Then adults juvenile are 8 weeks to 5 months. Adults 5 months to 7 years, and seniors 7 years plus. Sorry, that was a lot of numbers. Sorry. All right. So when we look at community outcomes, first of all, we had 2.4 million animals had a community live outcome. So that is all outcomes, live outcomes, excluding transfers. So again, we're looking at just down, at the community level. This is a decrease of 2%. So that equates to about 39,000 animals total. Then when we look at all outcomes, community outcomes, still excluding transfers, we had 2.8 million pets had a community outcome, which was down 2% as well. 1.3 million dogs had a community live outcome, which was about 3% less than the same time period last year. And cat community live outcomes remained more stable, with 1.1 million cats leaving organizations through live outcomes. And they actually had a 1% decrease. So very small changes. But when we look at it by dogs, so small and medium-sized dogs had higher adoption and transfer rates. This is not surprising when we think about it from a sheltering perspective. With large dogs actually being more likely to be returned to owner, but they also had a higher euthanasia rate. And we're going to really dive into a lot of the large dog data here in a little bit. And so stay tuned for all of that. Then we looked at outcome rate by total intake by org type. Again, lots of words, I know. So, but in the second chart here, we show private shelters and rescues depend the most on adoptions as the primary outcome. So you can really see the differences with those last two org types where adoptions are the primary source. But then, of course, with government shelters and then shelters with municipal contracts, we see a more diverse breakdown of the outcome rate. So especially with the government contracts that depend more on return to owner and return to field services. For cats, same thing. Same sort of chart, just by looks a little bit different here, but government shelters again see a little bit more of a diverse outcome type and more non-live outcomes. Private shelters and rescues, of course, depend more on adoption, so you see that adoption rate is much higher at 77% and 67% respectively. And then the other interesting thing to note on this chart is the waiting for outcome section. So at the very end, that waiting for outcome, of course, there are going to be more cats that are waiting for an outcome still at the end of the first half of the year because it is kitten season right now. So that's where we take, a majority of that look at the waiting for outcomes are kittens that are still waiting. So similar to how we looked at community intakes, we're looking at adoptions. So with adoptions for dogs right now, this is just looking at dogs, very stable and looking to the forecast about the same as we did in 2024. Large and medium dogs had decreases. So large dogs were a decrease of 9%, and then medium dogs had a decrease of 3%, respectively, over last year. But adoptions increased for small dogs by 6%. For adoptions for cats, again, with the chart that goes up, so May is really when we start to see all of those kittens coming in. Well, June, July, and August is when they're all getting adopted. So adoptions rose very dramatically during the summer months. Cat adoptions are remaining steady compared to last year. There has been a slight shift in the age of cats being adopted. So juvenile cats saw a 6% increase in adoptions. So again, those are the 8 weeks to 5 month old kittens, and adults and senior cats saw 7% decreases each. Okay. And then we looked at adoptions overall for dogs and cats when we put all those together. So now we want to hear from you, and we want to hear, I'm going to launch a poll. We want to hear how your adoptions are doing this year. So if you're an organization that processes adoptions, please let us know. Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? Same as last year? I'm gonna let this go for a second so we can see how it's going. All right. Final, final opportunity. All right, slowing down. All right. So hopefully you can see what those are looking like. So we are seeing that adoptions, for the most part, are decreasing. If you're an organization that processes adoptions, you're either decreasing or staying about the same as last year. That's great. 14% of the people in the webinar today say that 14% of them are increasing. And so thank you so much for helping us answer that question. All right, just a few more slides here. So when we looked at our animal level data, so this is analysis that we can provide thanks to some of our APIs that we have. So really dialing down into the nitty-gritty details, animal level data looks at an animal's journey from intake through whatever the outcome is of that animal. So government animal service organizations had the lowest adoption rate by org type when we looked at all intake types. So government and shelters with contracts have maintained adoption rates year over year, while private and rescue organizations are seeing increases for dogs and cats. And then we also looked at proportion of adoption by age of cats at intake. So this is looking at cats. And adult cats make up the majority of adoptions across all organization types, followed by kittens. Government animal organizations saw a higher percentage of kitten adoptions compared to all other org types. And adoption rate, our adoptions as a percent of total intake. For non-live outcomes, this first half of the year, we saw 366,000 non-live outcomes. Good news is down 2% compared to 2024. When we talk about non-live outcomes, we are talking about shelter euthanasia, animals who died in care or were lost. For dogs, 88% of non-live outcomes resulted in shelter euthanasia and 12% died or were lost in care. For cats, 70% were due to shelter euthanasia, while a notable 30% stemmed from dying in shelter or dying in care or being lost in care. And of course, when we look at this, we really look at kittens, and that is the most vulnerable population for cats for non-live outcomes. Then we broke it down by org type. So this is looking at non-live outcomes by org type. So government shelters do see the majority of the non-live outcomes, but they are also taking in nearly half of all community intakes. And so this is how it breaks down by org type for the first half of the year. New to this report, we also looked at lost and found data. So I'm going to do another poll because we are curious. How are your return to owners looking so far this year? Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? About the same? Of course, we have a lot of folks today that work for national organizations or other companies. This wouldn't apply, but you're curious of how this looks. So far this year, 317,000 dogs and cats were returned to their owners, down 3% compared to last year. And the data that we're going to show you does not include return to field. All right, so let's end this poll and we will share the results. So we are seeing about the same as adoptions. So majority are either the same or decreasing. 8% of you say that they are increasing. We would love to hear what you're doing to increase RTOs. Put that in the chat. That'd be amazing. And then several others in the webinar. This information doesn't apply. So thank you so much for answering that. Okay. With this, we looked at two figures. So we looked at return to owner as a percent of stray intake and return to owner as a percent of total intake. So when we looked at it by strays, we see that for dogs, of course, dogs are going to be the higher of the return to owners. We know this nationally tracks. But since government and shelters with municipal contracts account for 89% of all stray dog intake, 91% of all return to owners also happen with those organization types. They are seeing the RTO data impacts the most. Both org types have seen a 4% decrease in the number of dogs returned to their owner compared to 2024. And as a percentage of total intakes, these organizations have a rate of return to owner of 22%, which is 6 points higher than the national average. So thought it was really, really interesting to look at the lost and found data this year. This, again, was new to our mid-year report, so we were really excited to share this analysis with you. All right. Next up, Megan is going to come on with Hills to talk about their State of the Shelter report this year.
Thanks so much, Tori. That was really amazing data that has been compiled. So thank you guys for exposing that and making it available to this great group here on the call. I'm very excited today to talk about the Hills Pet Nutrition 2025 State of Shelter Pet Adoption Report. This came out in late July and is full of insights not only about pet adoption and what's happening across shelters throughout the country, but it's also focused on some really interesting data surrounding fostering, owner surrenders and returns, overall shelter perception amongst adopters, and more. So who specifically was surveyed as part of this, and how did the survey take place? A little bit of insight here. So the survey was gathered earlier this year. And it was a single blind survey that took place with a total of 2,500 consumers. 2,000 of those were American and 500 were Canadian. And the sample that we utilized was representative of those general populations based on those characteristics you see on the screen. For the purposes of today's presentation, the majority of the data that you see will be specific to the American consumer results. But if you go to hillshelterreport.com, you can not only get access to the full report, but there is also a section in the report that is specific to Canada. And we'll be releasing some additional Canadian specific data later this year. So some key takeaways from the report this year. Good news, adopter intent remains very strong. So what we found was that for the majority of Americans, 63% said that they would likely choose a shelter when they went to adopt their next new pet. This is absolutely fabulous. We want people obviously to be choosing shelters and rescues. But what we're seeing in actuality is that one of the top acquisition methods in 2025 was for both dogs and cats, individuals seeking adoption opportunities directly from family members or friends. Now, this could be because of lower cost, and we'll talk about cost here in just a few minutes, or it's an easier acquisition method, or just a search for familiarity. If you have a friend or a family member with a pet that is a known quantity, it may be easier for you to consider bringing that pet into a home instead of going to a shelter. We're also seeing some anecdotal evidence of shelters encouraging direct rehoming, either making direct rehoming options available on their websites or through platforms that they have, or just encouraging individuals to seek other routes for surrendering instead of those animals coming into shelters. So there is some anecdotal evidence here that could point to why that acquisition method is top of mind. As we move on, one of the things that is impacting the decision for Americans to adopt is the overall price tag for pet ownership. So 32% of Americans in our report stated that the initial cost to adopt or acquire a pet made it difficult to consider pet ownership. And that's the upfront cost associated with acquiring a pet. And then 48% reported that their biggest concern is the overall cost. So the ongoing costs over that pet's lifetime associated with care. When we double click on that, 64% of Americans reported that the cost of veterinary care itself directly impacts their decision to adopt. In fact, it's the #1 barrier to owning a pet year over year, regardless of the age, income level, or geographic location of that potential pet parent. And with veterinary costs continuing to rise, which I think everybody on this call is probably feeling, this likely isn't a surprise. So digging into specific demographics, when we look at Gen Z and millennial, in addition to the cost of veterinary care, these two groups are more likely to report that veterinary access factors, including availability of vet visits in all categories, from post-adoption vet visits all the way through urgent visits, as well as reliable transportation, these are all factors in their decision to adopt. So when we think about these younger generations, one of the things we've been noticing is this overall sense of guilt. It's pointing to the fact that younger Americans are not only feeling this accessibility gap, but that there's a pressure to meet this gold standard of pet care that's leading to some hesitation and guilt about whether or not they're ready to adopt. So in this space, what we're seeing is that shelters may have a key opportunity to emphasize that just an overall commitment to care, even if it's imperfect in what these folks are feeling, is enough to really consider adoption as a good way to bring a pet into their home. So some good news. Once someone adopts from a shelter, our research is showing that they are significantly more likely to adopt again from a shelter. So what you'll see here is that 80% of previous shelter adopters are likely to adopt from a shelter again. And of those who are interested in acquiring a pet, 56% who were not shelter adopters previously are also likely to adopt. And when we look at this specific to different age groups, again, Gen Z and millennial are showing stronger intent to adopt from shelters. So double clicking, there are some key adoption opportunities that are existing within these two demographics. So Tori, if you can go to the next one. Thanks. So 90% of Gen Z and millennials would consider adopting again from a shelter if they've already adopted, which is massive. You'll see this compared to Gen X and baby boomers. And you'll see this too. Gen Z and millennial are very, very likely to adopt, even if they've never adopted from a shelter before. And then even Gen X, which I think a lot of times there's a lot of emphasis on Gen Z and millennial as they are kind of the highest growing population of pet owners. But that younger Gen X population is also very, very likely to consider adopting from a shelter and shouldn't be left out from any targeted marketing or targeted strategies that you're putting into place to help convert these adoption intentions into action. So some more good news about our Gen Z and millennial friends. I think we are all probably recognizing that there is a large dog crisis and that our big furry friends are a little bit harder to place right now, but 1 in 3 Gen Z and millennials are likely to adopt a large dog. And what you see is that this growth is expanding from last year. So in 2024, 31% of those ages were willing to adopt a large dog. That is increasing, while Gen X and baby boomers are remaining flat. So again, aligning these targeted initiatives and focusing on Gen Z and millennials specific to large dog may prove to have some merit as you're looking at targeted strategies in your communities. One of the really big things that I was a little shocked by in reading our report is that 1 in 5 Gen Z and millennials are unaware of any shelters or rescues in their areas. When you look at this compared to Gen X and baby boomers, 10% of Gen X and baby boomers that responded stated that they were not aware of any nearby shelters or rescues. This figure jumps by 11 percentage points among Gen Z and millennial, which to me came as a surprise. They're a little bit more connected, but this also plays into specific targeted strategies for those audiences to maximize the intent and try to convert those that are really willing to adopt into actual converted adopters. So more good news, adopters are having positive experiences when they are coming to their shelter. So what we've seen is an increase in the positive shelter adoption experience over 2024. 93% of adopters that responded said that they had either a somewhat positive or extremely positive shelter adoption experience, and 90%, up from 88%, said that they had shelter adoption confidence that was positive or extremely positive. So setting realistic expectations about what the adopter may experience with their adopted pet, spending enough time with an adopter to understand their wants and needs, these were the strongest drivers of that satisfaction. Now, younger generations are definitely more likely to report post-adoption excitement, but they are also more likely than Gen X and boomers to report post-adoption anxiety. The fear is that the doubt and anxiety rises, right? A pet parent may return or surrender their pet. But the good news is that among Americans who received support or resources when considering surrender, 95% kept their pets. So let's flip over to fostering. This is another big focus area in shelters across the country, but also for Hills. So we definitely wanted to double click on our report on what the situation was with fostering. And what we found is that, you know, from 2024 to 2025, while active fostering is declining, awareness about fostering is increasing. So you'll see here on the screen that familiarity with the fostering programs is definitely going up. You guys are doing a great job making people aware. But there is a tremendous opportunity to unlock this potential. When we tried to figure out what the situation was and why more people were not fostering, one of the top reasons that we found was that foster parents or potential foster parents were unaware that the cost of fostering was going to be covered by the shelter. So a lot of them had this fear that they would have to pay for all of the upfront care, all of the veterinary care. And this is a huge opportunity for shelters to provide some education and really recruit fosters by letting them know that by and large, the majority of the costs are going to be covered. Outside of those costs, though, the Americans that we surveyed were very motivated by having access to an expert or a trainer while they had fosters in their home. So that was the number one thing that would motivate them outside of having costs covered. to incent them to participate in a foster program. They're also looking for foster pets that have experience with other animals. If they have animals in the home, they're looking for more short-term fostering options, and even some are looking for financial compensation for fostering. So a lot of great insights, and there's so many more in this report. If you're looking to get some more information or really dive into more specific metrics in each of these areas and some others, please visit hillshelterreport.com. We've put a lot of work and kind of heart into this and want it to be the most impactful resource for you. There's also quite a few case studies from partners across the country, shelters just like yours, who are instituting some really amazing programs to solve some of these challenges. And I would encourage you to check those out and learn from what they're doing. And of course, if you are interested in learning a little bit more about Hills and the Hills Food Shelter and Love Network, you can visit us at hillspet.com/shelters. We'd love to talk to you and figure out if there are ways that we can partner with you. Tori, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. That was such great information. I love when this report comes out every year because I mean, I've worked in sheltering for a long time, worked in this industry a long time, and it's like you always think it's like like what adopters are thinking, or like you have this mindset of why people potentially are fostering or not fostering, and this just like reinforces so much and just gives so many great insights that maybe like we kind of forget about. Like you just said, like people don't know that the cost of care is covered for the majority of people who foster. And of course, we welcome them to donate and things like that, provide assistance. But this is just such a valuable report to the industry every year. And so we kind of wanted to take a minute and go through some of the things you just talked about. So some of the data and like what our data says that's aligning with a lot of this so that you can kind of see the differences here. So you talked a little bit about this already, but walk us through again, like active fostering.
Yeah. So our data is showing that the familiarity with the fostering programs is definitely increasing. So our shelters are doing a great job across the country talking about fostering, encouraging people to apply. There are more and more people, and this seems to be a trend every year that we've done this report, that are familiar with the fact that fostering is a viable option to get involved in their local communities. But the number that are actually doing that is not is not aligning to that growth, right? So a lot of inspiration around fostering, but not as much action as we would hope to see. And we know that our shelter partners are feeling that. When we look at a little bit deeper into this, so 1 in 10 Americans have fostered, and that's not a huge number, and we would love for that to be 9 out of 10. but what we can say that is very positive is that even though it's down a little bit in 2025 from the data that we collected in 2024, a lot of Americans are viewing this as a positive way to give pet ownership a try. So they're looking at this as kind of a temporary test to see, and we do see quite a few pet owners that are worried that they're going to fall in love with their animal and they're going to adopt. You'll see that kind of on the right-hand side, 47%. It's a barrier for them because they're afraid they're going to end up adopting their foster pet. And I think I can speak for probably the majority of people on this call that we've all maybe felt that way if we've fostered before. But there are some other barriers that I think are really prohibitive in the minds of these consumers and the minds of these potential fosters, right? They want to do what's best for the pet. They're feeling the sense of guilt if they don't feel like they can maybe give that pet the gold standard experience. So they're worried because they already have pets. They may not have space for another. They may not have enough time, or they can't afford, again, affordability, the foster pet, or that they need to keep their pets separate from a foster pet, which we know in medical cases may be the case, but that enrichment and that interaction can also be very good. So these little nuggets on these barriers are all things that, we collectively as a community can work on educating to help kind of alleviate some of those concerns and maybe be that connective tissue so that someone that thinks fostering is a really great thing, but has all of these different reasons why, will start to see that those reasons maybe aren't necessarily reasons to
Mhm.
not.
Yeah, absolutely. So how does that compare to the SAC data? With those barriers in mind, we kind of have to like rethink of like how we can market to get new fosters, how we can continue to talk about it in a way that is easy for people to understand. They know all the ins and outs. Maybe you have all the information about fostering on your website that you can direct people to. This data that we have here is some data that we had for our Hills series that we're doing right now. But this is looking at ending counts of dogs in foster by month, by organization type. And so government organizations, which would also include shelters with contracts, you're seeing that over the past from January 2023 through the end of last year, their foster numbers have increased and continue to increase. We, of course, will have to look and see how 2025 data is looking. But when we look at rescues, the numbers are actually going down. And so overall, that could impact just foster counts in general, but that's something to be aware of, that it looks like foster-based rescue numbers continue to decline, while private shelters are still really remaining stable. And then we also wanted to talk about, in our report this year, we talked about days in care. So days in care are different than when we talk about the median length of stay numbers that we have talked about a lot with. So median length of stay is until adoption. So an intake to adoption, how long a pet is staying in the shelter. And when we analyzed for our 2024 report, we saw that the length of stay from until adoption had almost doubled by dog size compared to where we were pre-pandemic. But for this report, we looked at animals that are currently in care that are still waiting for an outcome. They have been waiting a median of 43 days for cats and 47 days for dogs. Large and medium dogs experienced adoption decreases by 9% and 3%. Small dogs increased by 6%, with cat adoptions remaining steady. And so when we're looking at those days in care, oftentimes we're waiting for that outcome, we're waiting for adoption, and these are, animals that we really need to focus on to get into foster, to get those outcomes so that they can leave our care and go to their new respective homes. So, and one thing that we talked about in our last webinar with the Unlocking Animal Data series with Hills was a dog day out program. So if you don't have a dog day out program, highly suggest you look into this, because for dog day out programs, it can be such a gateway to get into an adoption or foster scenario for that pet. And we have so many animals that come in as strays. We don't know that much about them. Going on a dog day out is such a valuable thing to be able to send these dogs out into the community, because we learned so much about them. So in our last webinar, we talked about Arizona Humane Society. We highlighted their program. So they launched a dog day out program in early 2024. Since then, they've had 782 dogs go on 1,800 outings. They've had more than 3,000 people signing up to participate. That is more people than they absolutely anticipated. This is such a great program because it's not as people just like think, oh, I can just take a dog out for the day. That is so great. With this, they reported on 21% were adopted within the first 48 hours of their field trip. The average dog goes on 2.5 trips, and the length of stay drops significantly after each one. And their program is built on low barrier participation, targeted data collection, and ongoing system optimization to get volunteer feedback after every single interaction. Great program.
I love that program. And I love seeing all the pictures of like all the dogs visiting Starbucks to get their blood cup. It's one of my favorite things to see on social media. But yeah, Tori, like when you think about the dog situation and specific when it comes to larger dogs, that length of stay for those larger guys is much higher than it is for the smaller medium dogs. But the good news here is that younger generations and maybe the demographics that are doing these dog day out programs, they're much more likely to adopt a large dog at this particular moment in time, and that's increasing, right? So in 2024, the data that we were able to collect said that 31% of Gen Z and millennials were interested and would consider adopting a large dog. That is increasing, while the older generations, the more senior generations here, are staying flat in terms of their intent. And when we look at some of the factors that are impacting whether or not someone is willing to adopt a large dog, obviously with any pet, preference is going to play key, right? If somebody just wants a smaller medium dog or a cat, that's going to be the primary influencer for what they end up adopting. But if you look at a lot of these other things on this list, a lot of these are perception, or maybe perceptions that could be used as an education opportunity. So I've I've had the fortunate experience of fostering several large dogs that are very lazy. They're not always energetic, and they may seem big, but they're couch potatoes. And, they weren't hard to manage. They were easier to manage than my 35-pound dog. So, there are opportunities here for shelters to kind of take this data and turn it into action by using stories like dog day out programs that are being started to kind of correct the misconceptions about larger dogs. Yes, they are going to be more expensive to feed than a smaller dog, and they are, not a small dog. So if you have a preference for that, or if you have landlord requirements that are limiting the number of pounds that your animal can be, those things still come into play. But several of these items are hot ticket items for what could be marketed kind of to correct in everyone's communities.
Absolutely. And then for our mid-year report, when we looked at some large dog data, we see that large dogs make up 29% of all intakes for organizations, but only 26% of all adoptions. So we have here the proportion of adoptions by dog size. And then on this second chart, we look and see, so this is proportion of org type intakes by dog size. So we see that rescues intake more dogs overall than any other dog size, fairly evenly distributed with government orgs and shelters with contracts. So we're looking at this large dog data and trying to deep dive into it a little bit more. It feels like more dogs are coming in that are large dogs, but this data shows that they're actually reduced compared to the other dog sizes, but we know that large dogs are staying in shelters longer. And then when we looked on this slide, so this is, these have dog proportions at age of intake for each org type and dog proportions of adoptions at age of intake by org type. So adult dogs, 5 months to 7 years, show on the third column to the right in the tables make up similar proportions of intakes as they do adoptions in each org type. But for shelters that are government, contract, and private, juveniles make up the higher proportion of adoptions than they do intakes, while senior dogs make up those lower proportions. We don't have statistical testing to confidently claim that one is more likely than the other to be adopted, but the data is showing noticeable shifts for juveniles that are up and seniors that are down in shelters. And rescues see similar proportion of each age group at intake and adoption as well. So Megan talked a lot about Gen Z and reaching younger audiences. So try these things. Obviously, like we know Gen Z is on TikTok. I'm on TikTok obsessively. I'm chronically online. It's fast, it's emotional, shareable content. When I worked in sheltering, we would just post all these videos of large dogs just being dogs, and it was amazing having such a huge reaction to a lot of these videos on TikTok. If you can do it, if you can't do TikTok, then Instagram Reels, Facebook Reels is also a great option. Doing behind the scene content, people love to see the ins and outs of sheltering. They love to see what goes on every single day, getting that emotional content. And then, of course, anything mobile and digital. Look at your website, look at your social media. How does it look on a phone? Because that is going to appeal to younger audiences. They're not looking at pets that are available for adoption as much on a desktop as they would be on their phone. So when they go to your website, what is that process for them? What does that look like? Be sure to test all of that out to make sure that everything you're doing is mobile responsive so that you can appeal to younger audiences. But of course, we want to hear from you. What's working? What's been impactful for you to reach younger audiences and adopt out large dogs? If you have some tips and tricks, we would love to hear them in the chat. Feel free to share those.
Love a good large dog playgroup video too behind the scenes. Those are always such a really fun music. Those are always chef's kiss. So we've talked a lot about dogs, Tori, but I just want to highlight that cats are still having their adoption moment, and adopters are more likely to adopt a cat across all kind of all age groups. So 40% of those that we polled were very likely to adopt a cat. 42% fell into that Gen Z millennial, and 37% fell into the Gen X baby boomer. And I would think that none of this is a surprise. The reasons for preferring cats have really remained consistent year over year. So, cats are perceived as more self-sufficient. Again, there's that personal preference component. And, you know, they don't require an outdoor area. So for pet owners that are considering whether they want to adopt a dog or a cat, they don't have to worry about a fenced yard or, you know, going out on walks in inclement weather. You know, cats also require less space. They groom themselves and they have a lower perceived cost of ownership. So there are factors that play into this. And I think some of the data that you're going to be sharing shows some of the results of this preference for adopting cats.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, yep, this is what we covered.
We just covered it. Sorry.
We just covered. Nope, we're good.
Cats are definitely having their moment. Sorry, I'm doing a terrible job driving. So with proportion, when we look at adoptions at intake, adult cats make up majority of adoptions across all organization types, followed by kittens. Government animal service organizations also see a higher percentage of kitten adoptions compared to other org types. And this is showing that 38% of government intakes are neonates, while 31% of adoptions are kittens that entered as neonates. And in the second chart here, you can see how when we break it down by org type on the proportion of adoptions at age of intake, uh, adult cats are making up majority of those adoptions. And side note, I just wanted to like mention like the reason like I think a reason that cats are having such a moment is the meme factor of cats. Like look at how many Instagram or TikTok accounts you follow that are cats. Like they're like if you are on that algorithm, like you're never getting off of it. And so cats are just like super fun. Like you just see like ridiculous names of cats these days, and all of that can appeal to younger audiences. It can appeal to people who are chronically online, like myself. And so cats definitely have a meme factor for sure. So in the interest of time, and Megan, if you're okay with this, we are going to go ahead and move over to our adoption pulse check survey. So you're going to see a few slides here that I'm going to go by, but I'm going to put the rest of this data in the recap. So we are going to talk about owner surrender information, some barriers to getting large dogs out. We're going to share all of that in the recap, and we'll share that data as well so that you have it. But in the interest of time, we really want to show you this adoption survey pulse check report. So sorry, moving forward, moving forward. And we're going to bring Stephanie back in here to talk about our adoption hours pulse check survey report.
Great, thank you. We're really excited to share this. As we were looking at the data for adoptions, really the last few years, we wanted to see if there was any information that we could glean to maybe have some opportunities for improvement that we can actually control. You know, we can't control some of the different things that are happening in our world, but there are some things that maybe we can control that will increase and improve adoptions. So next slide. So we did a survey earlier this year in May that we had 349 organizations that had responded. We focused on organizations that only had a physical facility, but we did include rescues because if they did have a physical location where they did bring animals for adoption, we wanted to include them as well in at least some of the questions. And then we did have equal representation with all 50 states except for Washington, D.C. And as you can see below, our org type breakout is listed. The majority of respondents were government agencies, which also includes private organizations with a contract. We lumped them into government, separated out private shelters, and separated out rescues. So we wanted to know open hours. There's a lot of conversation that is happening about, are shelters changing things? Are we changing intake policies? Are we changing adoption policies? One of the things that we know happened during COVID is shelters had to get creative with some of the government mandates and adjust their hours in some cases, or how animals were introduced to potential adopters. And so when we looked at open hours, here's the breakout with the range of hours. And so we saw for government, the highest percent of government organizations were open between 36 and 40 hours for the entire week, where for private shelters, we only saw their highest was about 21 to 25 hours per week. And if you think about the hours that you all are open at your shelters, throw it in the chat. And it's also, you can note if you're government or private, so we can see how that compares. And we shared some curiosity in this area, but we wanted to dive a little deeper. So the next slide, we wanted to look at days that are most commonly open for possible adoptions. And so, next slide. Yeah. Here's a poll we wanted to ask everyone is what days of the week is your shelter or rescue if you're doing on-site adoptions open? So select all or any that apply. And if it doesn't apply, if you're not one of those in-person adoption facilities, then just hit the last one. And as we're calculating that, okay, so this is very similar to what we saw in our results as well, where most organizations are closed. If they're closed on Sunday or Monday. So when we look at the data, again, breaking it out by government and private, you can see, if you want to add the percentages, you can see the highest rate of adoption hour or adoption days. Most shelters and organizations are open on Fridays and Saturdays. And again, most are closed on Sunday or Monday if they're closed at all. Next slide. So then we wanted to look at intake hours versus adoption hours. Are we open longer to bring in pets than we are to return pets or to adopt pets? And so we saw on the left, these organizations, or this is the percent of organizations that are open for intake or have fewer intake hours than they have adoption hours. The middle or the next one is they're equal. They're the same, open the same amount regardless of which counter you're going to. And then, of course, the ones that have more animal time or more intakes coming in throughout their day than adoptions is nearly half for private shelters, getting close to that for government, and about 20% for rescue. And then, of course, we have that area that do not do intakes at all. They only do adoptions, or do not do public intakes, I should say. They're likely the transfer in organizations. So next slide. So then we asked about same-day adoptions. High percentage of same-day adoptions for government, obviously lower on the rescue side. And about 20% of rescues that responded don't do same-day adoptions at all. Next slide. And it's one thing with the same-day adoptions, obviously that's contributing to our length of stay. If there's a family that is meeting a pet, they decide to adopt and they aren't able to take it home that day, that's extra day or days that's now adding to their time in care. So then we wanted to know, especially related to a post-COVID world, are adoptable pets able to be viewed in the housing areas by the public? Only about 2/3 are currently allowing that across organization types. There are some circumstances that it is allowed, but then there's about 10% of orgs that are just flat out not allowing the public to meet animals. Next slide. Also looking at potential opportunities that we could explore is requiring an application in advance of meeting a pet. And so right now, about 1/4 of government organizations are requiring an application prior to meeting a pet. 1/3 of private organizations are doing that, and almost half of rescue organizations are requiring that. And then, of course, there's some nuance in the middle about depending on the circumstances. But about 2/3 of government organizations do not require it. You can go meet the pet first, and then you can do the application process or adoption process after. Next slide. So when we look at adoption hours, Utah Humane is an organization that we had talked to because they had one of the longest ranges of adoption hours that we had seen when we first started looking at this earlier this year. You can see, obviously, too, their admission hours are shorter. So they are one of those organizations that's open longer for adoptions and shorter for intake. But one of the interesting things with them when we also look at days of the week is they had talked to us about how they are in a state that generally a lot of their residents are in church on Sundays. And so they were previously closed on Sundays and they were hesitant on opening. But when they did, they found that they had a ton of adoptions that came, even with that not being sure. And now it's actually their second, sometimes first busiest adoption day of the week. And so you can see they are open 11 to 7 even on Sundays, and then 10, they open an hour earlier on Saturdays every day. We partnered with a Shelter Love to look at some of their data that we could see adoptions by hour. And with their data set, we realized that 55% of adoptions were occurring between 5 and 8 p.m. Next slide. And we looked at the months of the year that had the highest occurrence of adoption, and we saw that that was November and December. So when we're looking at some of the data that we've thrown at you today, we know it's a lot of information. As Troy said, we're going to have a follow-up, so we'll be able to share this. You can dive into it deeper, of course, all of our reports. But we're seeing that more than 3/4 of dogs are arriving at government or contract shelters that are straight from the community, not from transfer. Intakes are outpacing outcomes at those organization types. And private shelters right now are balanced. As many animals are coming in as are going. And rescues are actually seeing more outcomes than intakes, so their populations are driving down. Fewer than 1 in 5 dog intakes into rescues are large dogs. About half of them are small. So our large dog transfer options are still slim. And adoption trends are obviously nearly identical, as Tori covered. And Sunday evenings, as we look, and Sundays and evening hours, as we look, are really likely a big opportunity where we can expand. And with that, I'll kick it over to Tori for a quick conclusion.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. So that report is going to be coming out very soon. We're really excited to share all of the results. There's some more data in there that we didn't cover today, but wanted to thank you all so much. I know we're a couple minutes over here. Thank you all so much for attending today. If you scan that QR code, that will take you to our full Unlocking Animal Data series that we are currently doing with Hills Pet Nutrition. Our next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, November 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we're going to be talking about big dogs and big challenges and how to move big dogs out of the shelters. And so a lot of the data that we didn't cover today, again, will be in that webinar recap because it's really, really cool data looking at some of the owner surrender versus stray data that we do have available from our mid-year report. So we'll share that. And then when you do go to that Unlocking Animal Data series, you can find all of our recaps of all of our webinars that we've offered so far this year, as well as our blogs. Our next blog is coming out where we're going to be talking about population balance as we move to the second or towards the end now of the year 2025. I can't believe it's almost Labor Day. That's crazy what happened to the year. Thank you all so much for attending today again, and we'll be sharing this recap and the recording if you want to share it with any of your teams. And of course, if you are interested in subscribing to Shelter Animals Count, scan that QR code or reach out to us. We would love to hear from you. Thank you all so much for attending and have a great rest of your day.